It was one of those October evenings when the rain comes down like nature has something to prove. The kind of rain that makes you want to stay inside with a warm cup of coffee and forget the world exists. But David Chen was stuck in traffic, watching his windshield wipers fight a losing battle against the downpour. He had just left another boring charity meeting at the community center. 3 hours of listening to people argue about how to spend money they didn't even have yet. As a tech entrepreneur who had sold his company for $47 million 2 years ago, David was expected to show up to these things. Part of being wealthy, he supposed. Give back to the community and all that. The traffic light ahead turned red for what felt like the 10th time in 5 minutes. David drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and glanced at his phone. No missed calls. No urgent emails. Just the usual stream of notifications he would deal with tomorrow. His life had become predictable in a way that money tends to make things predictable. Comfortable, sure, but predictable. That's when he saw her. At first, it was just a strange shape on the sidewalk near the park entrance. Something that didn't belong. David squinted through the rain-streaked window, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The streetlight cast an orange glow over the wet pavement, and there, crumpled against the brick wall of the old park gate, was what looked like a small person, a child. The light turned green, but David didn't move. Cars behind him started honking, their horns cutting through the sound of rain hitting his roof. He pulled over to the curb, not caring that he was probably blocking someone's driveway. His heart was already racing in that way it does when you know something is very wrong. He grabbed his umbrella from the back seat and stepped out into the storm. The rain immediately found every gap in his expensive suit, but he barely noticed. He was focused on the small figure ahead, and with each step closer, his concern grew deeper. It was definitely a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, lying on her side with her knees pulled up toward her chest. Her dark hair was soaked and stuck to her face, and her clothes looked like they hadn't been changed in days. But what made David's breath catch in his throat was her stomach. Even through her oversized sweater, he could see that her belly was swollen and round, making her look almost like a pregnant woman rather than a child. "Hey," he called out softly, kneeling down beside her.
Hey, sweetie, can you hear me?
The girl didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow and quick like a bird's. When David gently touched her shoulder, her skin felt cold and clammy, even through her wet clothes. She was unconscious, and from the look of things, she had been out here for a while. David had never been around kids much. His life was boardrooms and business dinners, not playgrounds and bedtime stories. But standing there in the rain, looking down at this fragile little person who clearly needed help, something inside him kicked into gear. The same instinct that had helped him build a successful company now told him exactly what to do. He carefully slipped one arm under her knees and another behind her back, lifting her as gently as possible. She weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of wet leaves. Her head fell against his chest, and he could feel how weak and lifeless she was. Whatever was wrong with her, it was serious. The nearest hospital was St. Mary's, about 10 minutes away if he drove fast. David carried the girl to his car, trying to shield her from the rain with his umbrella while fumbling for his keys. He managed to get the back door open and laid her across the leather seats, then grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat to cover her. "Hang on, kiddo," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "We're going to get you some help." The drive to the hospital felt like the longest 10 minutes of David's life. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that the girl was waking up. She remained still and silent, her breathing so quiet he had to strain to see the rise and fall of her chest. At red lights, he found himself thinking about her swollen belly. Was she pregnant? The thought made him sick to his stomach. She was just a baby herself. But what else could explain it? And if that was the case, where were her parents? How does a pregnant 8-year-old end up alone in the rain? By the time he pulled into the emergency room parking lot, David's hands were shaking. He had handled million-dollar negotiations without breaking a sweat, but this was different. This was a human life, and a young one at that. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than any business deal he had ever closed. He scooped the girl up again and ran toward the automatic doors of the emergency room. The bright fluorescent lights inside made everything feel urgent and clinical. A nurse at the front desk looked up as he approached, her eyes immediately going wide when she saw what he was carrying. "I found her outside," David said, breathing hard. She was unconscious on the sidewalk. "I think something's really wrong." The nurse was already reaching for a wheelchair, but David shook his head. She's too small. She'll fall out. Within seconds, the emergency room turned into controlled chaos. A doctor appeared as if from nowhere, along with 2 more nurses. They took the girl from David's arms and placed her on a gurney that looked enormous compared to her tiny frame. Someone was asking David questions. Where did he find her? How long was she unconscious? Did he know her name? But his attention was focused on the medical team working over her. They were checking her pulse, listening to her heart, shining lights in her eyes. One of the nurses was trying to start an IV, but the girl's veins were so small and dehydrated that it took several attempts. Through it all, the child remained unconscious, her face pale and peaceful, in a way that somehow made everything more frightening. "Sir?" The doctor was speaking to him. "We need to get her stabilized, but we're going to need some information." "Do you know this child?" David shook his head. "I found her by Riverside Park. She was just lying there in the rain." "Any idea how long she was out there?" "I don't know. Could have been hours." David felt helpless, wishing he had more answers to give them. The doctor nodded grimly and turned back to his patient. David watched as they wheeled her toward the treatment rooms, her small form disappearing behind swinging doors. He stood there in the waiting area, his expensive suit still dripping rainwater onto the hospital floor, wondering what he had just gotten himself into. He had no way of knowing that this moment would change everything. That finding this little girl would transform his carefully ordered life in ways he couldn't imagine. All he knew was that somewhere behind those doors was a child who needed help, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he wasn't going anywhere until he knew she was safe. David spent the next 4 hours in the hospital waiting room, pacing between the vending machines and the reception desk like a caged animal. Every time someone in scrubs walked by, he looked up hopefully, waiting for news about the little girl. But hour after hour passed with nothing. The coffee from the machine tasted like burnt water, but he kept drinking it anyway. His suit had finally dried, leaving wrinkled reminders of the storm that had brought him here. He thought about calling someone, but who? His assistant? His lawyer? What would he even say? "Hey, I found a kid and I'm at the hospital waiting to see if she's okay." It sounded crazy even in his own head. Around midnight, a tired-looking doctor finally approached him. Dr. Rodriguez looked like she had been working for 20 hours straight, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Are you the man who brought in the young girl?" she asked. David stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. "Yes, how is she? Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Rodriguez sat down heavily in the chair next to him, which immediately told David this wasn't going to be simple good news. "She's stable for now, but I need to tell you what we found. It's not what we expected." David's heart sank. "Is she pregnant? I mean, her stomach was so swollen and she's so young." "No, she's not pregnant," the doctor said quickly. "But what we found is almost worse. The swelling in her abdomen is caused by fluid buildup. Her kidneys are failing. Badly." The words hit David like a punch to the stomach. "Kidney failure?" "But she's just a kid. That's what makes this so heartbreaking," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "We ran blood tests and her levels are critically high. This didn't happen overnight. She's been sick for months, maybe longer. The fluid in her belly, the weakness, the unconsciousness. It's all because her body can't filter toxins anymore." David sank back into his chair. What caused it? How does a child get kidney failure? There are several possibilities. Sometimes it's genetic. Sometimes it's caused by infections that go untreated. In her case, we think it might be related to malnutrition and dehydration. Her body has been under severe stress for a long time. Malnutrition? David felt sick. "You mean she hasn't been eating?" Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "When she woke up briefly about an hour ago, she only spoke Spanish. We had to call in a translator. What she told us breaks my heart." David leaned forward. "What did she say?" "Her name is Lucia. She's 8 years old. She's been living alone in an abandoned building for the past 3 weeks." The doctor paused, letting that sink in. Her grandmother, who was her only family, died 3 weeks ago. Lucia didn't know what to do, so she just stayed in our hiding place, trying to survive on whatever food and water she could find. The waiting room suddenly felt too small. David stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the empty parking lot. 3 weeks? An 8-year-old has been living alone for 3 weeks and nobody noticed? It happens more than you'd think. Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. Lucia and her grandmother were undocumented. They lived off the grid, in places where people don't ask questions. When her grandmother died, Lucia was too scared to ask for help. She thought if anyone found her, they would send her away. David turned back to face the doctor. So she just survived on her own? She tried to. She told our translator that she was drinking water from puddles and eating food from dumpsters behind restaurants. Sometimes she would find half-eaten sandwiches or fruit that wasn't too spoiled. But it wasn't enough. Her little body couldn't handle it. The image of this tiny girl digging through garbage for food made David's chest feel tight. He had thrown away more food in the past month than this child had eaten in 3 weeks. "Can you fix her kidneys?" he asked. Dr. Rodriguez sighed. "We've started her on dialysis, which will help clean her blood for now. But her kidneys are severely damaged. She's going to need a transplant eventually, and even with treatment, she's going to be sick for a long time. What happens to her now? I mean, after she gets better? That's where things get complicated. We've contacted Child Protective Services. Since she doesn't have any known family and her legal status is unclear, she'll likely be placed in the foster care system once she's medically stable." David had heard enough horror stories about foster care to know that wasn't necessarily a good thing, especially for a sick child who didn't speak English and had no documentation. "Can I see her?" he asked. Dr. Rodriguez hesitated. "Well, you're not family, so normally we wouldn't allow it. But since you're the one who found her and brought her in, and since she has no one else," she stood up. "She's sleeping right now, but you can look in on her for a few minutes." They walked through a maze of hallways that all looked the same, past rooms full of beeping machines and worried families. The pediatric ward was quieter, with cartoon characters painted on the walls and smaller versions of everything. Lucia's room was at the end of the hall. Through the glass window, David could see her tiny form in the hospital bed. She looked even smaller than she had on the sidewalk, dwarfed by all the medical equipment surrounding her. Tubes and wires connected her to machines that beeped and hummed quietly. Her dark hair had been cleaned and brushed, and someone had put her in a hospital gown with little teddy bears on it. But what struck David most was her face. With the dirt and grime washed away, he could see that she was actually a beautiful child. Her features were delicate, almost doll-like, and there was something peaceful about the way she slept that made her look much younger than 8 years old. "The dialysis machine is doing the work her kidneys can't do," Dr. Rodriguez explained quietly. "She'll need this treatment 3 times a week, possibly for the rest of her life unless we can find her a kidney donor." David watched as Lucia's chest rose and fell slowly. One of her hands was curled around a small stuffed animal that a nurse had probably given her. It was a raggedy brown bear that looked like it had been donated by someone else's child. "She drew this while she was awake," Dr. Rodriguez said, showing David a piece of paper. "The translator said she wanted to thank the man who helped her." It was a crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. One figure was much taller than the other, and both were smiling. At the bottom, in shaky letters, someone had written "Gracias" in red crayon. David stared at the drawing, feeling something crack open in his chest. This little girl, who had been through more trauma in 8 years than most people experience in a lifetime, had used her strength to draw him a thank you picture. "What did you say her name was?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Lucia. Lucia Morales." David nodded, still looking at the drawing. "When will she wake up?" "Probably not until tomorrow. The dialysis makes patients very tired, especially children. I'd like to be here when she wakes up," David said. "If that's okay." Dr. Rodriguez looked at him curiously. "You can stay, but visiting hours end at 8, and they start again at 10 in the morning. I'll be back at 10, David said firmly. As they walked back toward the main hospital, Dr. Rodriguez seemed to be studying him. "Can I ask you something? You don't know this child. You have no legal obligation to her, and you've already done more than most people would. Why are you staying involved?" David thought about that question as they reached the elevator. Why was he staying involved? He had a company to run, investments to manage, a life that didn't include sick children and hospital waiting rooms. But when he tried to imagine going back to his empty penthouse and forgetting about Lucia, something inside him rebelled against the idea. Maybe it was because she had been abandoned by everyone else in the world. Maybe it was because her grandmother had tried so hard to protect her that they had lived in hiding. Or maybe it was simply because when he looked at that crayon drawing, he saw hope in a place where hope shouldn't exist. "I don't know," he told Dr. Rodriguez honestly. But I can't just walk away. David was back at the hospital at exactly 10 the next morning, carrying a bag from the gift shop downstairs. He had barely slept, spending most of the night researching kidney disease in children and foster care statistics. The numbers he found kept him awake until dawn. When he reached Lucia's room, he found her sitting up in bed, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. A nurse was trying to explain something to her in broken Spanish, but Lucia just shook her head and pulled the blanket up to her chin. "She's been awake for about an hour," the nurse told David. "She won't eat anything and she keeps asking for her abuela. That means grandmother, right?" David's heart sank. Of course she was asking for her grandmother. That was probably the only person who had ever taken care of her. "Is the translator here?" he asked. "She'll be here in 20 minutes. We called her as soon as Lucia woke up." David approached the bed slowly, the way you might approach a scared animal. Lucia watched him with dark eyes that looked too old for her 8-year-old face. When he got close enough, she recognized him and her expression changed slightly. Not exactly relief, but something less fearful. "Hola, Lucia," David said, using one of the few Spanish words he knew. "I'm David, do you remember me?" She nodded very slightly. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear her, she whispered, "Gracias." The translator arrived shortly after, a kind-looking woman named Mrs. Rivera, who specialized in working with children. She explained to Lucia where she was and why she was there, speaking in gentle tones that seemed to calm the little girl down. "She wants to know if she's in trouble," Mrs. Rivera told David. "She thinks she did something wrong by living alone." "Tell her she's not in trouble," David said firmly. "Tell her she's very brave and she's safe now." Mrs. Rivera translated, and for the first time since David had met her, Lucia smiled. It was a tiny smile, but it lit up her whole face. Over the next hour, with Mrs. Rivera's help, David learned more about Lucia's life. Her grandmother had brought her to America when she was just 4 years old, after Lucia's parents died in an accident back in Guatemala. They had been living in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, staying hidden because they were afraid of being sent back. Her grandmother did cleaning jobs at night, Mrs. Rivera explained. Lucia says she was always tired, but she would tell her stories and teach her to read. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman. Lucia spoke for several minutes in rapid Spanish, gesturing with her small hands. Mrs. Rivera listened carefully, then turned to David with tears in her eyes. She says her grandmother got very sick about 2 months ago, but they couldn't go to a doctor because they didn't have papers. Her grandmother kept working until she collapsed. After she died, Lucia didn't know what to do, so she just stayed in their hiding place and waited. Waited for what? David asked. Mrs. Rivera asked Lucia, then translated her response. She says she was waiting for her grandmother to come back. She didn't really understand that death is permanent. David felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. This little girl had spent 3 weeks alone, slowly starving because she thought her grandmother might come home. "Tell her I'm very sorry about her grandmother," David said. "And ask her if she needs anything right now." Lucia thought for a moment, then spoke quietly to Mrs. Rivera. "She wants to know if you're going to send her away," Mrs. Rivera translated. The question hit David harder than he expected. "Tell her I'm going to make sure she's taken care of. I promise." It wasn't until the words left his mouth that David realized what he had just committed to. But looking at Lucia's hopeful face, he knew he meant it. After Mrs. Rivera left, David pulled out the bag he had brought from the gift shop. Inside were coloring books, crayons, and a small sketch pad. He had remembered the drawing she had made for him and thought she might like to draw more. Lucia's eyes lit up when she saw the art supplies. She picked up a red crayon and immediately started drawing on the sketch pad. David watched as she carefully drew a small house with a door and windows, then added a stick figure of a woman. Standing outside, she showed him the drawing and pointed to the woman, saying something in Spanish. "Abuela," David repeated, understanding. "Your grandmother." Lucia nodded and smiled, then started on another drawing. This time it was a bigger house with 2 stick figures, one tall and one small. She pointed to the tall figure and then to David. David felt his throat get tight. In her drawing, they were standing together in front of a house with a big sun overhead and flowers in the yard. It was the picture of a family. Over the next few days, David found himself spending more and more time at the hospital. He would arrive in the morning and stay until visiting hours ended. He brought his laptop and worked from Lucia's room, taking calls and answering emails while she colored or napped. Lucia was still very weak from the kidney disease, and the dialysis treatments left her exhausted. But gradually she began to open up to David. Even without sharing a language, they found ways to communicate. She would show him her drawings, and he would point to different objects in the room to learn their Spanish names. On his fourth day visiting, David brought his tablet loaded with Spanish language learning apps. He spent an hour that afternoon learning basic phrases, while Lucia giggled at his pronunciation. When he finally managed to say "¿Cómo estás?" correctly, she clapped her hands and said, "Muy bien," so enthusiastically that the nurse came in to check on them. "She likes you," the nurse observed. "She doesn't react this way to anyone else." David looked at Lucia, who was carefully coloring inside the lines of a butterfly drawing. "I like her too," he admitted. It was true. Somehow this sick little girl had found a way into his heart that he didn't even know existed. Her bravery amazed him. Despite everything she had been through, she still smiled. She still drew pictures of houses and families and sunshine. She still said gracias every time he handed her a crayon. On Friday afternoon, a social worker named Mr. Johnson came to meet with David. They talked in the hallway outside Lucia's room while she napped. "The situation is complicated," Mr. Johnson explained. "Because of her immigration status, there are limited options. We found a foster family that specializes in caring for children with medical needs, but they're about 2 hours from here. She would have to transfer to a different hospital for her dialysis." David felt his stomach drop. 2 hours away? "I know you've been visiting her, and that's very kind of you. But you have to understand, Mr. Chen. This child is going to need intensive medical care for years, possibly for the rest of her life. She needs a family that's equipped to handle that." "What if I wanted to be that family?" David asked. Mr. Johnson looked surprised. "You want to foster her? Have you ever been a foster parent before?" "No," David admitted. "I've never even been around kids much. But I can't stand the thought of her being sent away from the only hospital that knows her case, away from the doctors who are trying to help her. Mr. Chen, I appreciate your concern, but fostering a medically fragile child is extremely challenging. It's not just about wanting to help. There are legal requirements, home studies, training programs, and then tell me what I need to do," David said firmly. Mr. Johnson studied David's face for a long moment. "Are you serious about this? Because if you are, I need to warn you that the process can take months, and there's no guarantee you'll be approved." David thought about Lucia's drawing of the 2 stick figures standing in front of a house. He thought about her saying gracias in that tiny voice. He thought about her waiting alone in an abandoned building for her grandmother to come back. "I'm serious," he said. "Whatever it takes, I want to try." That evening, David sat beside Lucia's bed as she worked on another drawing. This one showed 3 figures, a tall one, a medium one, and a small one. All 3 were holding hands under a rainbow that stretched across the whole page. When she finished, she held it up for David to see. Then she pointed to the medium figure and said a Spanish word he didn't recognize. "What did she say?" he asked the nurse. The nurse smiled. "She said papa. It means father." David looked at Lucia, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. In that moment, he realized that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about helping a stranger's child. This was about his daughter. "See," he told Lucia, pointing to himself and then to the drawing. "Papa?" Her smile could have lit up the whole hospital. The next 3 months were the hardest of David's life, and he had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. But this was different. This wasn't about spreadsheets and profit margins. This was about a little girl who called him Papa and drew pictures of their future together. The foster care application process felt like jumping through rings of fire while blindfolded. David had to attend parenting classes every Tuesday evening, sitting in a circle with other hopeful parents, while a counselor explained things like how to handle tantrums and bedtime routines. At 45 years old, he was learning about car seat safety and child-proofing outlets. "The thing about fostering children with medical needs," the instructor explained during one class, "is that you're not just becoming a parent. You're becoming a nurse, an advocate, and sometimes a full-time caregiver." David took notes like his life depended on it, because in a way it did. Lucia's life certainly depended on it. The home study was even more intense. A social worker named Mrs. Patterson came to David's penthouse apartment and spent 4 hours going through every room with a checklist. She measured the distance between the stair railings, checked all his cleaning supplies to make sure they were locked away, and asked him to explain his emergency evacuation plan. "This is quite a change from your current lifestyle," Mrs. Patterson observed, looking around his minimalist apartment with its white walls and expensive furniture. "Are you prepared for what it means to have a child living here?" David had already started making changes. He had converted his home office into a bedroom, painting the walls a soft yellow and filling it with furniture from the children's store. He had installed safety locks on every cabinet and outlet covers throughout the apartment. His glass coffee table had been replaced with something with rounded edges. "I know it's going to be an adjustment," David told her honestly, "but I'm ready for it." Mrs. Patterson made notes on her clipboard. "Mr. Chen, I have to ask this directly. You're a wealthy, single man with no children. There are people who will question your motives for wanting to foster a sick little girl. How do you respond to that?" The question stung, but David had expected it. He had heard the whispers at his country club, seen the raised eyebrows from his business associates. Some people couldn't understand why he would want to complicate his comfortable life. "3 months ago, I thought my life was complete," David said. "I had money, success, freedom to do whatever I wanted. But when I met Lucia, I realized I had been living only for myself. She needs someone to fight for her, and I want to be that person. Not because I have some hidden agenda, but because she deserves a family." Mrs. Patterson studied his face for a long moment, then made another note. Meanwhile, Lucia's medical situation was getting more complicated. The dialysis was keeping her alive, but it wasn't a permanent solution. Dr. Rodriguez explained that Lucia needed a kidney transplant within the next year, or her condition would continue to deteriorate. "The waiting list for pediatric kidneys is long," she told David during one of their weekly meetings. "And because of Lucia's immigration status, she's not eligible for many donor programs. We're doing everything we can, but it's an uphill battle." David spent his evenings researching kidney donation, calling specialists, and looking for any possible options. He learned about living kidney donation, where healthy people could donate one of their kidneys to save someone else's life. The more he read, the more convinced he became that this might be Lucia's best chance. "I want to be tested," he told Dr. Rodriguez one afternoon, "to see if I could be a donor for Lucia." Dr. Rodriguez looked surprised. "Mr. Chen, that's incredibly generous, but the odds of you being a compatible donor are very slim. You're not related to her and you have different blood types. But it's possible, right?" "Technically, yes. But even if you were compatible, the surgery carries risks, and you'd need to go through extensive psychological evaluation to make sure you're making this decision for the right reasons. Then let's start the testing," David said firmly. The donor evaluation process was almost as intensive as the foster care application. David had to undergo dozens of medical tests, psychological evaluations, and meetings with counselors who made sure he understood the risks involved. During one of these sessions, Dr. Miller, the transplant psychiatrist, asked him a question that stopped him cold. "Mr. Chen, imagine that you go through with this donation, but then for some reason you're not approved to foster Lucia. You would have given her a kidney, but she would still go to another family. Would you still want to proceed?" David thought about that for a long time. Finally, he said, "Yes, because it's not about me getting something in return. It's about her having the chance at a healthy life no matter who raises her." Dr. Miller made a note and smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." While all this was happening, David continued his daily visits to see Lucia. She was getting stronger, but the dialysis treatments were taking their toll. Some days she was tired and cranky. Other days she was her usual cheerful self. David learned to read her moods and adapt accordingly. On her good days, they would work on their Spanish and English lessons together. Lucia was incredibly smart and picked up English words faster than David was learning Spanish. She especially loved learning the names of animals, and would quiz David by drawing pictures and making him guess what they were. On her difficult days, David would simply sit beside her bed while she slept, answering emails quietly or reading. Sometimes he would bring his guitar, a hobby he had picked up in college but rarely had time for anymore. Lucia loved it when he played soft songs, even though he was terribly out of practice. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in January. David was in the middle of a business meeting when his phone rang with a call from Dr. Rodriguez. "I need you to sit down," she said when he answered. David's heart immediately started racing. "Is Lucia okay?" "Lucia's fine, but I have news about your donor testing." David, you're a match. For a moment, David couldn't speak. Are you sure? I've never seen anything like it. Your tissue compatibility is nearly perfect. It's like you were meant to be her donor. David had to excuse himself from the meeting and go sit in his car. The odds of being a compatible donor for someone unrelated were supposed to be tiny. But somehow, against all medical probability, his kidney could save Lucia's life. That evening, he sat with Lucia while she colored in one of her books. He wanted to tell her the good news, but he knew she wouldn't fully understand what it meant. Instead, he watched her carefully color inside the lines of a picture of a house with two people standing in front of it. "Papa," she said, holding up the picture. "Sí, mija," David replied, using the Spanish word for my daughter that he had recently learned. "Papa." 2 weeks later, Mrs. Patterson called with more good news. David had been approved as a foster parent for Lucia. The paperwork would take another few weeks to finalize, but barring any unexpected complications, Lucia would be able to come home with him. "I have to warn you," Mrs. Patterson said. "The first few months are going to be challenging. She's going to need time to adjust to living in a home again. And with the transplant surgery coming up, there will be a lot of stress for both of you. We'll figure it out together," David said. That night, he sat in Lucia's new bedroom, looking at the stuffed animals he had arranged on her bed and the drawings she had made that he had framed and hung on the walls. In a few weeks, this room would no longer be empty. It would be filled with the laughter and tears and everyday chaos of a real family. David had thought he knew what success looked like. But sitting in that little yellow bedroom, surrounded by evidence of the life he and Lucia were about to build together, he realized he had been completely wrong. This was what success actually felt like. 6 months after that rainy night when David first found Lucia, he was walking through the same hospital corridors. But this time everything was different. Instead of being a stranger desperately worried about a child he barely knew, he was a father preparing to give his daughter the gift of a healthy life. The kidney transplant surgery was scheduled for early morning. David had spent the previous night in the hospital with Lucia, both of them trying to stay calm despite their nerves. She had drawn him another picture, this one showing two people in hospital beds holding hands with a big heart floating above them. "You nervous, mija?" David asked in his much-improved Spanish as they waited for the surgical team. Lucia nodded but then pointed to the drawing. "We do this together, Papa." Dr. Rodriguez had explained the procedure multiple times, but David still felt butterflies in his stomach as they wheeled him into the operating room. The last thing he saw before the anesthesia took effect was Lucia being wheeled into the room next door, giving him a brave little wave. The surgery took 6 hours. When David woke up in recovery, the first thing he asked was about Lucia. The nurse smiled and told him the transplant had been successful. His kidney was already working perfectly in her small body. "The doctors say it's like the kidney was made for her," the nurse said. They've never seen such a perfect match between unrelated donors. 2 days later, David was able to visit Lucia in her recovery room. She was sitting up in bed, looking more alert and energetic than he had seen her since the day they met. The color had returned to her cheeks and her eyes were bright. "Papa!" she called out when she saw him, switching to English. "Look, I feel so much better." It was true. Without the toxic buildup in her system, Lucia was like a completely different child. She was chatty and curious, asking the nurses questions about everything in the room. The doctors were amazed at how quickly she was recovering. "This is what she was supposed to be like all along," Dr. Rodriguez told David privately. Before the kidney disease took over her life, this was probably her natural personality. Bright, energetic, full of questions. You're seeing the real Lucia for the first time. 3 weeks after the surgery, David and Lucia finally went home together. As they walked into the apartment, Lucia ran from room to room, exploring everything with the excitement of a child who had spent most of her life in hiding or in hospitals. "This is my room," she asked in English, standing in the doorway of the yellow bedroom David had prepared. "This is your room," David confirmed. Lucia threw herself onto the bed and hugged one of the stuffed animals. "It's so soft. And look, you put my pictures on the wall." David had indeed framed every drawing she had made during her time in the hospital. The walls were covered with her artwork, pictures of houses and families and rainbows and animals. It looked like the room of a child who was loved. The first few months of living together were an adventure neither of them was fully prepared for. David learned about things he had never imagined, like how to braid hair, why 8-year-olds need to eat every 2 hours, and how many questions one small person could ask in a single day. Papa, why's the sky blue? Papa, where do clouds come from? Papa, why do fish live in water? Papa, can we get a fish? David answered every question as best he could, often looking things up on his phone when he didn't know. They got the fish, a small goldfish that Lucia named Esperanza, which means hope in Spanish. Lucia started school in September at a private academy that had experience with children who had been through trauma. Her teacher, Mrs. Kim, was amazed at how quickly Lucia adapted to classroom life despite having missed so much formal education. She's incredibly resilient, Mrs. Kim told David during a parent conference. And she's reading at a level well above her grade. She must have had someone who cared about her education before. Her grandmother, David said. She taught Lucia to read even though they were living in very difficult circumstances. Lucia made friends quickly, though she was sometimes shy about explaining her medical history. David taught her how to talk about her kidney transplant in simple terms that other children could understand. I was very sick, but my papa gave me one of his kidneys to make me better, she would explain matter-of-factly. Now I take medicine every day and I'm healthy. The other parents at school had mixed reactions to David's story. Some were genuinely amazed by what he had done. Others seemed suspicious or confused by his decision to adopt a sick child from such a different background. David learned to ignore the whispers and focus on what mattered. Lucia was thriving. Their evening routine became David's favorite part of every day. After dinner, they would sit together on the couch while Lucia did her homework and David worked on his laptop. Then they would read together, sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish. Lucia was determined to keep her Spanish strong while also mastering English. I want to be able to talk to both kinds of people, she explained. English people and Spanish people. That way I can help other kids like me who get scared at the hospital. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Lucia made an announcement that changed everything again. Papa, I want to help other kids who don't have families. David looked up from his computer. What do you mean, Mija? At school, Mrs. Kim told us about kids in foster care who don't have anybody. Kids like I was before I found you. I think we should help them. Over the next few weeks, Lucia's idea grew into something bigger. She wanted to create a program to help children in foster care, especially those with medical needs. David was amazed by his daughter's compassion and determination. What if we started a foundation? David suggested. We could help kids get medical care and find families who understand what they need. Lucia's eyes lit up. And we could teach people that sick kids aren't scary. They just need extra love. That's how the Lucia Foundation was born. David used his business experience and resources to create an organization dedicated to helping medically fragile children in foster care. Lucia became the foundation's youngest advocate, speaking at events and helping to raise awareness about the need for specialized foster families. Their first major success came when they helped a 7-year-old boy with diabetes find a foster family trained to manage his condition. When David and Lucia visited the boy in his new home, watching him play with his new foster siblings, Lucia squeezed David's hand. We did something good, Papa. Yes, we did. Mija. On the first anniversary of Lucia's transplant surgery, they went back to visit Dr. Rodriguez and the nurses who had taken care of them. Lucia had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds. Her hair was thick and shiny, and she practically bounced when she walked. I can't believe this is the same little girl we met a year ago, one of the nurses said. She was so sick and scared. I was waiting for my family, Lucia said simply. I just didn't know it yet. Dr. Rodriguez pulled David aside while Lucia was showing the nurses pictures of her goldfish. You know what the most remarkable thing is about this whole story? She said. It's not the medical miracle of the perfect donor match. It's not even the successful surgery. It's watching you both become exactly who you were meant to be. That evening, as David tucked Lucia into bed, she handed him her latest drawing. It showed a man and a little girl standing in front of a building with Lucia Foundation written on it. Around them were dozens of other children, all holding hands. This is our future, Papa, she said. We're going to help lots of kids find their families. David hung the picture on the wall next to all her others. Looking at the progression of her artwork over the past year, he could see the story of their journey together. It started with lonely figures waiting for something better, and ended with communities of people helping each other. "Sweet dreams, mija," David said, kissing her forehead. "Sweet dreams, papa. Thank you for finding me." As David turned off the light and closed her bedroom door, he thought about that rainy night when he first saw a small figure collapsed on the sidewalk. He had thought he was saving her life, but the truth was much more complicated than that. They had saved each other.